Let's talk about burnout in policing. But to start, we have to understand what burnout is. What was once described as those living in their parents' basements who have a proclivity for marijuana, burnout actually relates to a chronic form of psychological strain that is increasingly common among professionals who have high levels of emotional interactions with the public. And research suggests that there are actually two primary components to burnout: exhaustion and disengagement. Exhaustion relates to the physical, emotional, and cognitive exhaustion that comes from being overwhelmed with work-related demands and not having enough resources to deal with them. And when we're talking about resources, this can relate to not enough time, money, energy, manpower, or even having the emotional capacity to deal with ongoing issues. Disengagement is when officers begin to distance themselves from their work and just start going through the emotions and even start to develop negative attitudes, not only towards the work, but towards the people who do the work and also the industry as a whole. So to understand how burnout impacts officers, we have to understand that burnout is a gradual and insidious process that likely occurs over time. And burnout is like having a small battery in your body, and energy is produced from the small battery. So throughout the day, as you expand the energy, the power is drained from the battery. Yet, things like taking breaks, laughing with colleagues, someone bringing donuts, getting compliments, closing a case, or having moments that make you feel good about your work, all of these things really help recharge your battery and help you to continue to function well. And burnout really stems when there's not enough positive input from work and from life outside of work to really help recharge that battery. So over time, if officers aren't getting the resources necessary to help recharge that battery, the battery starts to become less effective over time, and you are dealing with officers who do not have the emotional, physical, or cognitive capacity to deal with ongoing issues, and then they become much more disengaged, they become much more cynical, and that creates issues not only within the agency, but also towards the services provided to the communities which officers are responsible for protecting and serving. While research on burnout and policing is relatively new yet ongoing, a lot of the research has identified several personal and work-related factors that are associated with increasing the risk for officers to develop emotional exhaustion and disengagement. The first are personal factors. So the personal factors related to burnout tend to relate to demographic factors. So officers who are most likely to experience exhaustion and disengagement tend to be female, younger, officers who are struggling to develop a balance between work and their profession and their personal lives, and officers that struggle with managing the stress from the job spilling over into their personal life, and then vice versa. So issues in the personal life spilling over and creating issues in their work life. So while personal factors matter, what really drives burnout has to do with work-related factors, particularly aspects of the job in which officers themselves do not have control over. So this could be things like excessive workloads, having too many cases, calls for service to handle with very few resources to accomplish these demands, not getting recognition, having supervisors who are micromanaging, or just dealing with members of the public who are the worst, who are violent, annoying, or exhausting. And burnout can also stem from this imbalance of work and family demands and the resources necessarily to meet them. So overwhelming work-family demands can significantly decrease job satisfaction and increase burnout, while actually having access to resources to help deal with these problems can actually increase job satisfaction and reduce burnout. And so the takeaways from this information is understanding that burnout, one, is not something that suddenly happens. It develops over time, it is gradual, and it's very insidious. In fact, most of the time, people who are burned out are usually the last to know. But in order to be proactive agencies now know that there are personal and work-related factors that they can be cognizant of, not only during recruitment, but throughout one's career. So for personal factors, these are not only important for those of you who might be interested in pursuing careers in policing or in the justice system, but also for those of you who are going to be supervisors and administrators, to be much more aware of, which officers are generally at a greater risk for burnout. And this is fairly consistent across professions. Usually it's going to be employees who are really gun-ho, they want to get their feet wet, and they just become so overwhelmed with getting involved. They tend to be a lot younger, relatively new to the profession, especially among females. Females are much more likely to develop burnout than males, and also for officers and employees who struggle to develop a healthy work-life balance. And additionally, what really drives burnout is not necessarily the individual factors, it is the work-related factors, particularly aspects of the job that officers may not have control over. As officers, they don't have control over how many calls for service that they have to respond to. They don't always have control over the policies and procedures that they have to follow. And so when those really conflict with what officers perceive to be fair and reasonable, it can start to become much more emotionally and physically exhausting, and they become much more bitter and cynical. And so if officers don't have the resources necessary to meet the work demands, so those factors that really help rejuvenate our internal battery and make us excited to come to work and to challenge ourselves, when we don't have things like time, equipment, training, resources, people that are fun to work with, they just exhaust our battery, and over time we have to throw those batteries out. And so the people who have thrown those batteries out tend to be the ones who are increasingly bitter. They hate everything about the job. Nothing seems to work out well for them. They just become increasingly cynical, bitter, and it is these individuals that we really need to focus on to be much more proactive, because these are the individuals who are most likely to either leave that agency or leave the profession overall.